Michael always thought of himself as the dependable one, a steady achiever, a loyal friend, and someone who never allowed the chaos of emotions to disrupt his orderly world. But there he was, in a foreign city on the last night of an unforgettable trip, questioning whether he'd missed out on a life worth living. The trip had been everything he hoped it would be, exploring historic landmarks, trying out street food, and sharing laughs with his friends. But now, at the club, his friends had peeled off one by one, each managing to charm a partner for the night. Michael sat at the bar, nursing a drink, his sense of unease growing with every passing minute. He wasn't bitter. He loved his friends, but he felt the familiar pang of not quite belonging. Despite his good looks and kind demeanor, he had always been a little awkward socially, a nerd who thrived on facts and debates rather than flirtation and small talk. Still, watching his friends disappear with winks and waves left him feeling lonely and a little embarrassed. Don't be the odd one out, his mind whispered. His fingers hovered over his phone, hesitating, before he finally searched for a local escort service. His heart pounded as he completed the booking, feeling a mix of guilt and adrenaline. It wasn't about intimacy, he told himself. It was about the illusion, the story he could tell his friends. The rendezvous point was a nearby cafe. She'd be wearing a white dress, the app had said. Michael's palms were sweaty as he entered the cozy establishment, scanning the room nervously. Then he saw her. She sat at a corner table, her white dress flowing elegantly around her. She was stunning, dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her lips slightly parted, her gaze distant. But something about her felt off. Her eyes were red, and her expression was pained, as though she'd just fought back tears. Michael cleared his throat. "Hi," he said, mustering a smile. She looked up sharply, her face briefly flashing with irritation. Before she could reply, a man's voice interrupted. "Who's this?" The tone was cold, possessive. Michael turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man walking toward them, his jaw tight. The woman's demeanor shifted instantly. Her eyes burned with fury as she snapped. "Why do you care?" The man's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Aren't you moving on a bit too quick?" Her lips curled into a bitter smile. "I didn't realize how much trash you were until a minute ago. Thanks for opening my eyes." Michael blinked, unsure whether to intervene or slink away unnoticed. But before he could decide, the woman grabbed his arm. "We're leaving," she announced, her voice firm. Michael was too stunned to resist as she dragged him out of the cafe. "Hey!" the man shouted after them, his tone desperate, but she didn't look back. She marched toward a car parked nearby, practically shoving Michael into the passenger seat before climbing in herself. "I'm sorry for dragging you into this," she said, starting the engine. Her hands gripped the wheel tightly, and her jaw was clenched. "Bear with me. I'll drop you off somewhere safe." Michael stared at her, his mind racing. "What just happened?" She sighed, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "That idiot back there was my boyfriend, well, ex-boyfriend. He dumped me about 5 minutes before you walked in. Then he had the audacity to act jealous. Unbelievable. Michael hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I'm sorry." She laughed bitterly. "Yeah, well, I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there. Anyway, I didn't mean to involve you. Just tell me where to drop you off." Michael hesitated, then decided honesty was the best policy. "Actually, I think I made a mistake. I thought you were someone else." The woman raised an eyebrow, glancing at him. "Someone else?" Michael cleared his throat, his face burning. I thought you were an escort. That I hired." The car swerved slightly as she turned to gape at him, her mouth slightly open. "You what?" "It's not what it sounds like," he said quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. I didn't mean anything bad. My friends, well, they all paired off, and I just wanted to, I don't know, fit in. It was stupid. I'm sorry." For a moment, she stared at him, her face unreadable. Then, to his surprise, she burst out laughing, a genuine, melodious sound that filled the car. "Wow," she said, shaking her head. "That's honestly kind of pathetic. But also, weirdly sweet." Michael's face burned. "I'll just get out here." "Don't be ridiculous," she interrupted, a mischievous glint in her eye. "You've already been dragged into my mess. The least I can do is make sure you have some fun." How about we go clubbing? What? Michael blinked, taken aback. You heard me, she said with a smirk. I just got dumped. You hired an escort. Clearly we're both in weird places tonight. Might as well embrace it. Michael hesitated, but something in her smile made him say, okay. What followed was a night Michael would never forget. The two of them hit the clubs, dancing and laughing like old friends. She introduced herself as Elena, her sharp wit and easy charm putting Michael at ease. They clicked photos, downed drinks, and even crashed a karaoke bar, where Elena's terrible singing had them both in hysterics. But as the night wore on, Michael noticed Elena drinking more heavily. She laughed louder, danced wilder, and clung to him like a lifeline. Beneath her vibrant facade, he sensed a deep sadness she was trying to drown in alcohol. When they stumbled back to Michael's hotel room, both of them slightly drunk, the atmosphere shifted. Elena's playful smile faded, replaced by a look of vulnerability. I want to forget everything tonight, she whispered, her face inches from his. Because tomorrow, I won't be the same. Michael's breath caught as she leaned in, her lips brushing his. He hesitated, but her warmth and the electricity between them made it impossible to pull away. That night, they shared a passion that left Michael breathless, his heart pounding in a way it never had before. When Michael woke up, the bed was empty. Elena was gone, leaving no note, no trace. Only her first name and the faint scent of her perfume lingering on the pillow. He felt an ache in his chest he couldn't explain. It wasn't supposed to matter. It was just one night, but somehow it had felt like more. Michael couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He wasn't the kind of man to have casual flings, and the memory of Elena lingered far longer than he'd expected. He'd spent the flight home replaying the night in his mind. The way she laughed, the bittersweet vulnerability in her voice, and the cryptic way she'd said, I won't be the same tomorrow. Back home, Michael tried to focus on his job as a legal advisor for a prestigious firm. The hustle of work was a welcome distraction. Recently, he'd been appointed as acting chief legal advisor after his boss's accident, a role that demanded his full attention. Yet, even the mountain of paperwork and the parade of meetings couldn't fully distract him. He'd catch himself wondering, where was she now? Did she think about that night too? 2 weeks later, Michael was called to attend the orientation of a new director for the conglomerate's clothing division. It wasn't unusual for him to meet new hires. His legal expertise often intersected with their strategies. Still, he entered the conference room that morning with little interest, assuming it was just another routine briefing. Until he saw her. Elena stood at the head of the room, addressing the small crowd. She wore a sleek, tailored suit, her hair pulled back in a professional bun. Her demeanor was cold, commanding, and entirely unlike the lively woman he'd spent that unforgettable night with. But it was unmistakably her. Michael froze, his breath catching in his throat. The whispers around him filled in the gaps. Elena Vasquez, recently hired as the director of design after a high-profile dismissal from her previous company. Accusations of leaking proprietary information had left her reputation in shambles. Her acceptance of this job, which came with a demotion from her former position, was seen as a desperate move. She finished her introduction and stepped down from the podium, her expression unreadable. As the crowd dispersed, their eyes met for the first time. Her cold facade cracked for a fraction of a second, a flicker of recognition, a twitch of her lips, before she steeled herself and walked past him without a word, her hand brushing his briefly as they passed. Michael stood there, stunned. It was definitely her. But the warmth and spark he'd seen that night were gone, replaced by a distant, icy exterior. What happened to her? He wondered. Michael couldn't let it go. He spent the rest of the day distracted, replaying the fleeting interaction in his mind. By evening, he decided he had to speak with her. He found himself outside her office, heart pounding as he knocked on the door. But she wasn't there. Her assistant informed him she'd left for the day. I'll let her know you stopped by, the assistant added. As Michael walked toward the elevator, he was debating whether to let it go. Maybe she really didn't want anything to do with him. Just as the elevator doors were closing, a hand darted through, forcing them open. It was Elena. Before he could say a word, she grabbed his arm, and pulled him into an empty meeting room. She pushed the door closed, her back to it, her face inches from his. Her scent, sharp and floral, brought back a flood of memories. "What do you want, Michael?" she asked, her voice low and firm. "I just wanted to talk," he said, struggling to keep his composure under her intense gaze. "About what?" Her tone was defensive. "Whatever happened between us, it was just one night. It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. About that night. And now, seeing you here." She cut him off, her expression hardening. "Look, I've been through hell to get this job. I don't need anyone, especially someone like you, dragging me down. Whatever happened, forget about it. It was just a dream, but I can't forget it," Michael said, his voice rising slightly. "I've been dreaming about it every night." "About you?" Elena's cheeks flushed, but her expression didn't soften. She let out a frustrated sigh. "You're impossible." She turned to leave, but hesitated. "Don't come looking for me again unless it's about work." She stormed out, leaving Michael standing alone in the room, his chest tight. But something in her hesitation gave him hope. She wasn't as unaffected as she wanted him to believe. It didn't take long for circumstances to force them together. A critical project involving a potential legal dispute landed on both their desks. Michael and Elena were assigned to work closely to resolve the issue. Their interactions were tense at first, professional on the surface but charged with unspoken emotions. When Michael and Elena were assigned to work together, he initially hoped the proximity might give him a chance to break through her icy demeanor. But Elena was a consummate professional, keeping their interactions strictly about work. She was polite but distant, her responses clipped, and her focus unwavering. Michael, unsure how to approach her, decided to give her the space she seemed to need. He was no expert in matters of romance. He'd never been the type to chase or charm. If anything, his awkwardness when it came to personal relationships often left him at a loss. So he buried himself in the work, focusing on the legal intricacies of the case they were handling. He told himself that, in time, maybe things would ease between them naturally. A week into their collaboration, during a strategy meeting with the broader team, Elena presented a series of well-thought-out changes to overcome a critical bottleneck in the project. Her ideas were direct, clear, and practical. Michael nodded along as she spoke, impressed by her insight. But just as Elena finished, a voice interrupted. It was Mr. Graham, the assistant director, a man who had been openly antagonistic toward her since her arrival. Michael had overheard the whispers. Graham had been vying for the director position, and Elena's appointment had dashed his hopes. Since then, he'd done everything in his power to undermine her. "That's a bold suggestion," Graham said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But don't you think it's a little reckless? This isn't your old company, Miss Vasquez. We don't take risks without thorough evaluation." Elena's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "I've analyzed the data thoroughly," she replied calmly. "The risks are minimal and the benefits outweigh them. This is the most efficient way forward." Graham scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Efficiency isn't everything. We need to consider." "With all due respect," Michael interrupted, his voice firm, "Elena's analysis is spot on. I've reviewed the same data, and her approach is the best solution we have. Delaying further will only increase costs and risks." The room fell silent. Graham glared at Michael, but the murmurs of agreement from other team members began to swell. Several heads nodded, and someone murmured, "That actually makes sense." Seeing the tide turn, Graham folded his arms with a huff. "Fine, but if this backfires, don't expect me to clean up the mess." Elena stood tall, her expression calm, though Michael noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders relax. As the meeting concluded and people began to leave, her gaze met his. For the first time, her eyes softened, the faintest trace of gratitude visible in their depths. Later that evening, as Michael was organizing his notes in his office, there was a soft knock at the door. He looked up to find Elena standing there, her usual guarded expression slightly lighter. "Hey," she said, stepping inside. "I just wanted to say thank you for earlier." Michael shrugged, offering her a small smile. "I was just doing my job. Your plan made sense. It deserves support." Her lips twitched, and for a moment, she seemed almost irritated. Right? You'd have done it for anyone then. Michael frowned, sensing the shift in her tone, but unsure what he'd said wrong. Well, yeah, if it made sense. Elena's face twitched, her jaw tightening. Good to know, she said coolly, turning toward the door. In that case, I won't bother treating you to dinner as thanks. It's not like it's anything special. Before he could respond, she walked out. Realizing he'd somehow offended her, Michael quickly gathered his things and ran after her. Elena! Wait! He called, catching up to her just as she reached the elevator. She turned, raising an eyebrow. What? I'm starving, he blurted, the words tumbling out in his usual awkward fashion. And, I think dinner sounds great. You can thank me over food. Her lips twitched, and for a moment, he thought she might smile. You're impossible, she muttered, but she stepped into the elevator with him. Fine, but you're paying for dessert. Over dinner at a quiet restaurant nearby. The conversation was tentative at first. Michael, ever the overthinker, kept fumbling through topics until Elena, perhaps out of pity, began steering the conversation herself. Gradually, the atmosphere became more relaxed. Then, as they were finishing their meal, Michael hesitated before asking the question that had been on his mind for weeks. What really happened at your old job? Elena froze for a moment, her fork hovering in midair. Then she sighed, setting it down. You probably already know the rumors, she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. They think I leaked confidential information to a competitor. But the truth is my ex did it. Michael's eyes widened. Your ex? That guy. She nodded, her expression hardening. He had access to my devices, passwords, emails, everything. He stole the data, leaked it, and pinned it on me to cover his tracks. And because he was senior to me, everyone believed him. That's awful, Michael said, his fists clenching. Didn't you try to fight it? I tried, she said bitterly. But they were quick to dismiss me. Said it was a breach of trust. No one cared about the truth. Michael leaned forward, his legal instincts kicking in. Even if they believed you were guilty, they can't just fire you without due process. That's wrongful dismissal. Elena blinked, surprised. What are you saying? I'm saying we can fight this, Michael said firmly. I'm a lawyer, remember? If we can prove your ex was the one who leaked the data, not only can we clear your name, but we can hold your old company accountable for what they did. Elena stared at him, her guarded expression cracking for the first time. You'd really do that? Help me? Michael smiled warmly, leaning closer to Elena as if to convince her with the weight of his sincerity. Of course, everyone deserves justice. And while you deserve to get your life back, Elena's lips curled into a faint smile, and she shook her head. I appreciate it, Michael. I really do. But I've moved on. That chapter is closed. Her words were polite, but in her mind, she thought, he doesn't know how dirty this corporate world can get. They don't play fair. They bury you. Even if you're right, it doesn't matter when all they need is a scapegoat to placate shareholders and the board. They chose me because I was convenient. She recalled how quickly her ex had turned on her, spinning his lies to protect himself. The board hadn't cared about her side of the story. All they wanted was a resolution, and she had been the easiest target. Even if I won, it wouldn't matter, she reasoned. People would see me as a liability, a lawsuit waiting to happen. My career would still be over. But Michael's earnestness, his unwavering belief in her, made her heart soften. Few people had ever stood up for her like that, and fewer still without expecting something in return. Perhaps he was naive, but his willingness to help, to care, touched her. You're a good guy, Michael, she said, her tone lighter. Maybe too good for this world. But let's not dig up old graves. He seemed to accept her answer, though his lingering gaze suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. From that day forward, Elena found herself opening up to him more. They became friends in the truest sense, sharing jokes, frustrations, and even a few late-night conversations over coffee in the office. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Just as things were beginning to look up for Elena, trouble came knocking again. The boardroom was tense. Elena sat at the head of the table, flanked by Michael and other senior executives. A legal notice from her former company had been delivered that morning. They were suing Elena and the conglomerate, accusing them of intellectual property theft. They're claiming our new line of products is a copy of their unreleased designs, said Graham, the assistant director, his voice heavy with faux concern. The timing is convenient, don't you think? His smirk betrayed his satisfaction at seeing Elena under fire again. Elena's fists clenched under the table. This is ridiculous. Those designs are mine, original, created months before I joined this company. Then how do you explain this? Another executive asked, sliding a file across the table. Inside were side-by-side comparisons of her designs and those from her former company. The similarities were undeniable. Elena's heart sank. She knew the truth. The designs had been stolen from her laptop, likely by her ex during his betrayal, but proving it would be nearly impossible. And the accusations were already causing damage. The media had picked up the story, dragging her name through the mud once again. Michael spoke up, his voice steady but firm. This is clearly a coordinated attack. They're trying to discredit Elena and this company. We need to investigate thoroughly before jumping to conclusions. But the room remained skeptical. Elena left the meeting feeling defeated, her career on the brink of collapse. She had been here before, and she wasn't sure she could survive it again. That evening, Michael found Elena in her office, staring blankly at her computer screen. "Hey," he said softly. "I know it feels hopeless, but I'm not giving up on you. We're going to figure this out." Elena looked at him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I can't fight them, Michael. They have all the power. Even if I prove I didn't steal anything, my name will be ruined. Then we'll prove it in a way they can't ignore. We will prove them wrong for every allegation." Right from the start, he said, determination etched into his features. "Do you know what work I did before joining here?" he asked with a smile. Elena looked at him in confusion. "I was a prosecutor," he replied with a smile to Elena's shocked expression. "I got stabbed once, forcing me to change my job. After all, I am the only one my mother has. Believe in me a bit. It's not like I am not aware of the dark side of the world." He seemed to have perfectly read Elena's mind. There was a confidence in his voice which seemed to put Elena at ease. "So, let's start with the designs. If your ex stole them, there has to be evidence." Michael began his work. He tirelessly pored over the details of Elena's old case. Using his legal knowledge, he identified several key angles to explore. Michael enlisted the help of a trusted IT expert to comb through Elena's old laptop. They discovered metadata embedded in her design files, showing they had been created months before the alleged theft. This alone was a strong point in their favor. After that, using the evidence, he obtained court approval to access communications from Elena's former company. Focusing on her ex-emails revealed, he had sent files to a third-party vendor, who was later linked to the unreleased designs. He asked Elena if she had ever shown her designs to a former colleague. Elena nodded. It was a company with whom she had long ties producing her products. The person was willing to testify that Elena had shown her the designs well before they were allegedly stolen. Michael dug into her ex's history, uncovering a trail of unethical behavior and complaints from other colleagues. This helped paint him as a less credible figure. When the case finally went to court, Michael represented the conglomerate while Elena sat beside him, her nerves barely contained. The opposing counsel tried to argue that the designs were developed in-house at Elena's old company, but Michael systematically dismantled their claims. He presented the metadata, the email trail, and the witness testimony, each piece of evidence building an airtight case. By the time he finished his closing arguments, the judge seemed unimpressed with the opposing side. The ruling was clear. Elena was exonerated, and her former company was ordered to issue a public apology for their false claims, as well as compensate her for her wrongful dismissal. The victory was bittersweet for Elena. While her name had been cleared, the ordeal had taken its toll. But Michael was there, steady and unwavering, reminding her that she was stronger than she thought. One evening, as they sat on a park bench overlooking the city, Elena turned to him. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. "You saved my life." Michael smiled, his hand brushing hers. "I didn't save you, Elena. You saved yourself. I just reminded you of what you're capable of." Elena's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself believe that things might finally be okay. "You really are too good for this world," she said, her voice tinged with affection. "And yet, I seem to fit perfectly into yours, he replied with a grin. They stayed there, under the soft glow of the city lights, their bond stronger than ever. What had started as a chaotic night had blossomed into a partnership built on trust, respect, and love, a second chance for both of them to rewrite their stories. That's all for today. If you like the story, then hit that subscribe button for more such content.